I was kind of juggling with the idea, like I've been working a couple chapters for some books, and I wasn't sure which one to present. Like there's one that I've been writing for a thing with Julie on the death drive and being towards death on Heidegger. And on the other side, I've been dealing with another topic on the Tiresias, the blind prophet that appears a lot in Greek mythology. It is this latter topic that I'm going to be focusing on. And the idea that I'm trying to focus on is that Tiresias offers a model for thinking of the different reconfigurations and changes that can happen in psychoanalysis. So the idea that I'm trying to offer is that a figure such as historically we've known Oedipus, for example, has become a model for understanding the unconscious. And I'm going to elaborate why we rely on myth and also why Oedipus has become so prevalent. But why the point I'm trying to make is that Tiresias offers us an alternative model to account for some issues that I'm going to elaborate on. So the idea why I'm interested on this topic to begin with is that from what I can tell, there seems to be a pervasive restlessness at the heart of psychoanalysis. So if we look at psychoanalysis from an outsider point of view, I'm here particularly interested on like ideas like feminism, queer theory, postcolonialism, critical race theory. There always seems to be a problem with psychoanalysis. You know, it is sexist, homophobic, racist, transphobic. You just can't keep like adding terms on that. And the thing that gets my attention is that there's always this sort of irreducible excess to psychoanalysis that it is struggling to catch up with. And it becomes more evident when we try to universalize claims about psychoanalysis. I think this particularly happens when we try to take philosophical consequences out of psychoanalysis. So I'm certainly of the opinion that sometimes some of these critiques can characterize psychoanalysis, but I still think there's an element of truth in claims like this, and that they don't necessarily hint to some external accident to psychoanalysis, but actually I think this is an internal and constituted impasse to it. So the thing that I'm interested in about this is I will call this tension, this sort of like restlessness at the core of psychoanalysis, the symptom of psychoanalysis, the sort of like discontents around it. I think the presentation before that actually might have alluded a little bit to those sorts of discontents. And I'm particularly interested in the mythological figure of Tiresias as a mythological model that can help us articulate the symptom, as well as helping us articulate and formulate psychoanalysis' integral capacity to mutate and change the basis in which it models any subjects and models that concern it. In a sense, Tiresias doesn't only help us articulate the symptom of psychoanalysis, but what I'm trying to suggest is that Tiresias can also operate as the symptom of psychoanalysis. And by that, and I'll elaborate on this term, but symptom tends to mean a form of synthetic symptom or a sort of answer to the ambiguities that we're dealing in the clinic. I'll provide a little bit more detail. But the idea is that the symptom is taking a symptom and operating it as a creative strategy for essentially dealing with the ambiguities that one comes across in the case of the clinic, for example. And the idea that I'm trying to invite psychoanalysis here is to deal with this restlessness as something that is at the heart of psychoanalysis, and that it needs to lose itself in the truth of this restlessness in order to come out the other side re-embodied. So I'm going to be telling a little bit about the myth of the Tiresias. I'm going to be discussing a little bit of the limits of Lacanian and Freudian psychoanalysis, as well as engaging with the questions of like transgender psychoanalysis and matricial theory in the elements of like how Bracha-Edinger engages with it. So the myth of Tiresias tends to be, like many Greco-Roman pieces of literature, it tends to be having like a lot of different features, emphasis, and versions. There's some remaining elements, for example, that he was born from a shepherd called Everest and a nymph called Charliclo. And so there's also another set of elements that are pretty consistent, that he's a shape-shifting prophet, that he's blind, and that he changed sexes twice. And so we find that there's a variety of different literary references to Tiresias. We can find Tiresias being mentioned in Homer's The Odyssey, Callimachus' poem, The Bathing of Pallas, Ovid's Metamorphosis, the Oedipus trilogy by Sophocles, Guillaume Apollinaire, Les Mamelles de Tiresias, and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And all these different things offer us different perspectives, again, of what we can take from Tiresias. In Ovid's Metamorphosis, for example, Tiresias transforms into a woman for 7 years after disturbing 2 large snakes mating. And after having this experience of changing sexes twice, there's this story where Zeus and Hera are having a debate about whether women or men have the most pleasure. And they turn to Tiresias because Tiresias has been on both sides. So they are looking for counsel in regards to that question. In Callimachus, the bathing palace, Tiresias is blinded after gazing upon a naked Athena. A significant encounter on a few accounts. For one, Athena's being a goddess of wisdom, but also having the symbolic weight of Athena being associated with multiple birds, shape-shifting, cross-dressing. So there's some queer elements to Athena's depiction. In T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, Tiresias offers a sort of like outlook on the disjointedness of modernity, the discontents of modernity, essentially, what he describes again as the wasteland. And Tiresias has this vantage point in which he's able to grasp the stakes of modernity. In Apollinaire, Tiresias' breasts act as this sort of like bursting the bubble of fantasy for her husband, when Tiresias, at that point named Therese, basically breaks the facade of a feminine masquerade and then adopts the name Tiresias. And then in Sophocles, Tiresias counsels Oedipus and Creon in Antigone and Oedipus the king. And in the Odyssey, it's interesting to note that Tiresias maintains the gifts of prophecy in the underworld, where one may note in the Odyssey, like most people are shells of themselves. It's very unusual that Tiresias remains having like a sense of a substantial way of being himself. So there's some interesting like threads that might be significant to consider in this respect. For one, that Tiresias offers a certain vantage point to the ambiguities and partialities of like sexuality. Tiresias is portrayed as having an intimate knowledge of feminine and masculine sexuality. In his blindness, Tiresias has this fundamental knowledge, of course, and his capacity of prophecy is also tied up to a transgressive act, like seeing Athena naked. Furthermore, also in the case of both Tiresias but Oedipus and Colonus, we find that a grasp of this fundamental truth takes a hold of these characters when they lose their sight. They have to stop seeing in order to actually like see something, essentially. Not only does Tiresias transgress, these set of boundaries about two sexual positions, classically like the masculine and feminine, but also Tiresias oscillates and breaks the boundaries of life and death in many ways. And so the thing that this is not exhaustive by any means, but I think it offers a certain understanding about what Tiresias can offer for psychoanalysis, which can, specifically in this as sexuality, it'll be most apparent that it can approach the question of sexuation or sexuality in a way that it can be very obscuring of the possibility of anything other than the masculine and the feminine. And so the point of why I'm turning to myth specifically is it's just we're not trying to exemplify psychoanalysis through myth, nor are we trying to exemplify something of myth in psychoanalysis. It's more that the way in which we use myth in psychoanalysis is a way of modeling the psychoanalytic orientation and the kinds of things we find therein, whatever subjects and objects there are. And here I'm quoting Lacan in Seminar 1, where he notes, and this is I think the crux of why we use myth, that when we get on, and this is a quote, when we get on the trail of the unconscious, what we encounter are structure, organized, complex situations, end quote. So the appeal to myth offers a symbolic and a structural articulation of a model rather than a mere image. It has this capacity to account for these formal situations of the unconscious according to their clinical and practical efficacy. I'm not just coming up with a myth just to say, this is a cool, nice story to tell about a person. When it comes down to a question of psychoanalytic interpretation, it has to have an efficacy to it. It has to have an effect on the person that we're treating in the process. And so the point that I'm interested about Tiresias is that Tiresias operates as a threshold for Lacanian psychoanalysis, and I think he's also a herald of the changes that we're going to be seeing in the future of psychoanalysis. So on the end of thinking about myth, usually when we think about myth in psychoanalysis, we think of Oedipus. That's pretty apparent in Freud and Lacan from the get-go. For Freud, Oedipus articulates an incestual and a patriarchal set of thoughts that even if they're detested in our most immediate and natural awareness of them, they speak to some fundamental drive that we can only learn through sources such as mythology, folklore, symbols, jokes, and other sublated forms of the unconscious. And so for Freud, when we find this sort of like symbolisms, we can point to, of course, the well-known phallic symbolisms, but also ionic symbolisms, that is to say more like vaginal forms of symbolisms. In the instance of the feminine side, for example, Freud tends to refer to rescues from water, fertility of landscapes in imageries of Mother Earth, oceanic feelings, and uncanny womb fantasies, sketching out a sort of like notion of maternality, feminine, what Bracha goes on to call the matrixual complex, but which is left untouched. And then from the masculine side, of course, we're very well familiar with the phallus. Like that's very commonplace at this point. So we're dealing with implicated articulations of sexuality. And the problem that we find in Freud is that feminine sexuality and even sexuality itself remain a riddle in the final analysis. And while phallic and masculine understandings of sexuality remain commonplace and it seems obvious, that's actually the riddle behind them. So, and this is the point about what we're coming across here in psychoanalysis. These are complexes that we grasp through myth and narrative that are there even if we don't fully understand them. For Lacan, myth is an articulation of the drive and the libido. So the idea is that the meaning of the myth is this truth that is articulated in a contradiction that these things are. On top of that, like, Lacan doesn't just refer to myths like Oedipus and whatnot. He makes some of his own. The major examples tend to be things like Le Omelette and De la Mela, which are all mythological articulations of a pre-sexual cod drive of sexuality, which he can only offer a sort of like speculative mythological image for. So while Lacan is well known for his transformative return to Freud, taking all these myths and these kind of things in psychoanalysis that may seem outdated and turn them into mathens or formalizing them or trying to find a way of like making them more scientific. And this is putting it pretty crassly. Lacan's deployment of myth still remains crucial for him. It is an act of modeling, and this is the wording that we find in Lacan. It's an act of modeling the antimonic psychic relationships that we encounter in the analytic relationship. Again, it's those unconscious complex structures that we come across. In the 1956 to 1957 seminar on the object relations, he particularly focuses on the case of Melanie Klein treating Little Hans, where she pretty explicitly deploys Oedipus as a form of myth to account for the treatment. But the point is that we're not dealing with myth as something that is superimposed. It's more of a primary fact and activity akin to a narrative fiction or a structure that has a singular relationship to a truth, insofar as truth is structured like a fiction. So the point that Lacan makes a lot throughout this specific seminar is it's not a question of so much saying that, oh yeah, this kid just fits into the structure. The myth is actually itself an interpretation, but the interpretation is an activity, it's an intervention. So it is supposed to enable some sort of change. And in the instance of Little Hans, the point was that it was trying to get him from being into a position where he had no symbolic relationships to being able to start articulating symbolic relationships, starting to place himself in relationships to others and linguistic relationships for that matter. So the myth gives us an idea, and this is me quoting Lacan, an idea of the weight, the presence, and the instance of the signifier such it's a specific impact. And so this brings us to the theory and the logic of the signifier in Lacan, and this is going to, again, become the problem for us. So the signifier marks the beginning and the end of the Lacanian unconscious Lacanian field. The signifier, its symbolic articulation of the Oedipus complex, concern, and I quote, the entire field of human relationships where the assumption of sex is decided, end quote. In the signification of the phallus, which is one of the texts of Écrit, the signifier is described as a contingent yet necessary disturbance of human sexuality, around which the assumption of sex undertakes idiosyncratic and antimotic strategies, articulating the disturbance. Again, I think people like Patricia Geravici describe this as like sex is on, or assumption of our own sexuality is a failed answer to a failure, essentially. And this is the crux of sexuation in psychoanalysis. While in Freud, we find that the distinction between the penis as the biological organ and the phallus as a symbol is not that clear. For Lacan, the phallus it has nothing to do with an anatomical distinction. We may have troubles with that, of course, but the point for him is that a signifier, an introduction of intersubjective space, happens that cuts upon our imaginary register and the real register and introduces the subject to the symbolic. Again, in the case of Little Hans, the idea of the usage of Oedipus as an interpretation is to introduce exactly that space. The cut of the signifier, of course, has contradictory effects in the constitution of sexuated subjects, such as the masculine and the feminine. Again, this is no longer an unrecognizable and differentiated sexuality like the lamella. And instead of this inhuman sexuality and plenitude of the lamella as an indestructible organ of sexuality that spills everywhere, the cut of the signifier reveals a paradoxical space localized in two lacks. On one end, there's an alienation in the constitutive failure of the subject, and on the other end, there's a separation as the constitutive failure of the other. The unconscious is, in essence, the short circuit between these two failures. The unconscious is sexual insofar as it's fundamentally skewed in the assumption of our sexual relation, of our sexual assumption, I should say, or position, on the basis of a sexuated strategy, again, around which both the subject and other are structured. In the position of the unconscious and the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, Lacan breaks this down in this perspective in terms of like understanding the forced choice that he characterizes as the veil of alienation, and then the end of the operation of psychoanalysis as this self-engendering attribution of this choice to oneself that he calls the veil of separation. The movement from alienation to separation is nonetheless a return to alienation when Lacan notes, the veil returns in the form of a veil. And that's, again, in the instance of French, like the E is silent, so there's this ambiguity between the feminine still returning to some masculine appeal. So the remark is suggesting in terms of like indicative of an oscillation between beginning and endings of these two superimposed lacks. One can think of the figure of the psychoanalysis terminable and interminable in this respect. And the ambiguity, again, of this masculine and feminine expression of the same term, the veil and the veil, is symptomatic of the terminal point of the psychoanalytic field, in a sense. The phallic signifier is an operative impulse of psychoanalysis. This is the assumption that we take in order to be able to carry out Lacanian psychoanalysis. And then when we start introducing the notion of the sans pomme, the point is that we're looking for an articulation of non-phallic psychic phenomena. And this is something that becomes pretty pertinent in Lacan's later work. And so here's where Tiresias becomes pertinent to us. Way before the sans pomme becomes a thing in Lacan, so Lacan actively alludes that there are limits to the Oedipal myth as a model for psychoanalysis. The point is, this is the first model for complex situations of the unconscious that has been offered to us, and incidentally has become its standard. But this is a privileged status that this myth has received, and for Lacan, as he notes as early as Seminar 1, he describes it as this is a myth that is part of it's a minuscule part of a larger myth. The way that he sees it too is just this is the quote that I find interesting. This should not keep us from perceiving other structures belonging to the same level, to the same plane of the law, which can be given just as decisive a role in someone's experience. So there's somewhat of an invitation. We need to look past Oedipus to some extent and come up with our own myths, the same way that Lacan does. And so later on, of course, like Lacan starts introducing these elements of dealing with these non-phallic sexual dynamics. For one, Lacan is very much interested in the notion of the feminine as a not all. And he's also interested on the question of transsexuality as this kind of problematic space for attempting to be outside sex. I am going to skip a little bit of this, though, to essentially get to the point that what we're finding at this point with Lacan is that we're seeing a threshold point of how psychoanalysis is able to captivate these complex structures that we find in the clinic. What we're invited to do at this point is to start utilizing different myths in order to articulate it. And this is what we find interesting in later cases. To kind of get to the introduction of the sans pomme specifically, Lacan describes the Sutton thumb as a, and here I quote, but not that, as in anything but not that. Which interestingly enough characterizes also the feminine not all for Lacan. One could say that, and this is put in it idiomatically, but the Santon rolls with things. It just kind of goes along with the vibe of things. One makes one's own home rules in order to be dealing with the complex situation one is dealing with. And Lacan is particularly interested in articulating the notion of the Santon through the work of James Joyce, where I think a couple of the few things we can note of Joyce's writing here that are appropriate to the notion of the symptom is that his use of language appropriates the structuring of narrative with portmanteaus, stream of consciousness, oscillating between interior and exterior narratives in one and the same sentence, breaking any sort of like straightforward linearity. Another aspect of Joyce's writing that I find interesting is just that Joyce is in this point of a form of part of a spiritual liberation of Ireland under British colonialism. So there's a form of intralinguistic resistance within the language of an oppressor in this instance, to the point that like Joyce's use of language was considered obscene by British authorities, which in fact censored him at points. But the point that Lacan makes is that in dealing with these conditions, what Joyce did is come up with a creative strategy for dealing with this question, coming with his own assumption of a language that is not even his in a sense. What he did is he formulated a decision to try to articulate and describe his own relationship to jouissance in this sense, rather than again constraining himself to the masculine or feminine ways of describing it, or the alternative. And this is again Lacan's point that Joyce, for him, avoided psychosis by finding a way of describing his own Santon. So for him, the Santon is an alternative to the name of the father, the phallic signifier, Oedipus in many ways. And in fact, Lacan gets to the point of relativizing all of these things to say they're just different modalities of the Santon. So what I find interesting at that point, and this is focusing more on transgender cases specifically, or like queer cases, there's a couple texts that get my attention. One is by Genevieve Morel called The Sexual Santon, and another one is Transgender Psychoanalysis by Patricia Geravici. So in the first one, the Sexual Santon, Morel essentially says, you know, we are gonna be able to find Freudian men and Lacanian women. Sure, there are familiar paradigms that we can find, but when we pose ourselves this kind of like Turing experiment of can we, by listening alone, determine whether or analysant's sexuation is, it becomes troubling the more that we find these case-by-case scenarios that don't necessarily fit to, again, these given models that we have adopted and set as our standards. So Morel gives this example of a patient called Ilse, who is trying to bypass the sexual ambiguity surrounding phallic force choice through a choice of her own, at a point where she becomes a mother, or becomes a parent, but she doesn't want to adopt the role of the second mother because of her own associations with mother figures. And she doesn't want to assume the role of a father because of another set of issues in that respect. So she is trying to come up with her own way of inscribing her relationship to her wife and her child. So she develops her own Santomi, not calling herself the mother or the father, but calling herself the parent. And then in the instance of the Santomi in transgender cases, you know, what we find is not so much, and I think I mentioned this in the instance of my of the session where I was being asked questions, that it's not so much a question that we're denying, the trans people are denying the real and the body. In fact, Lacan actually gets to this point, that the transgender person takes the body very seriously, in fact. The Santom becomes a sort of way in which the body is trying to get a hold of itself. The transgender Santom takes the body seriously as an artwork, as an embodiment that is a work in progress, in a sense, in a body that is gaining a consistency of its own form. And what we find interesting is that the transgender Santom is not looking to be outside sex, like people like Catherine Milotz try to argue, but the idea is that it's trying to establish a sexual difference still. It's not outside sex. And so while on one end, we are pretty used to seeing this question of like transgender changes in sexes as the main issue with transgender questions. The other aspect that Geravici points out is also a question of life and death. And this is where Tiresias is interesting as a figure that is not only changing sexes, but also transgressing life and death. So the idea is that when we're dealing with transgender experiences, what we're dealing with is with the development of a son thumb, in this instance, transitioning, as a creative reclamation of one's own life as livable. A way of basically tying up relationships with the body, the drive, and sexuality in a way that becomes their own way of setting rules around it, essentially. So the other aspect that I find interesting in terms of like how people try to articulate these sorts of like differences would be Braha Ettinger's work on the matricial border space. The idea with Braha essentially is that while Lacan makes the notion of the feminine, because like traditionally through the phallic and Oedipus and the name of the father, there's no possibility of knowing woman in a sense. She's not all. What Braha is essentially trying to argue is that we are able to theorize a transsubjective space that stands besides the phallus as the space where individualized subjectivity emerges through the phallic cut. It said the matricial border space is this sort of intersubjective field that facilitates subtle transmissions, links, transgenerational weavings between people, ways of essentially connecting a cluster of people in ways that are unconscious still. So the idea, again, is that we're dealing with an unconscious complex. And what I find Braha is doing in this case is coming up with a myth of her own so we can find a way of modeling this instance. So for Braha, the idea is that this comes ultimately with a different sort of like ethic altogether for psychoanalysis. While people like, for example, like Lacan or Donald Winnicott, which very different kinds of psychoanalysis, when we find relationships between mothers and child, I think this is a really good example of what Braha is trying to get at. The relationship between a mother and her child is a relationship between essentially strangers who are intimately with each other. They have a relationship. They have a knowledge of each other, even though it's not explicit in some way. But the problem when we look at it from an Oedipal standpoint or from a phallic standpoint is that the possibility of this sort of like primordial love or motherhood is often just treated as something that is incestuous and something that is patricidal. And so the possibility of thinking about this is often thought as a form of like letting go of oneself into psychosis, into some sort of like oceanic feeling, as Freud would put it. One's relationship to the mother is considered essentially as the possibility of psychosis. And what Ettinger is trying to like articulate with her own explorations of myths, such as the Demeter-Persephone complex, is that we're dealing with trying to articulate ways to think about motherhood and the feminine that are not constrained by these standpoints, and that we can make sense of the kind of like loves that we're considering at the level of the matricial, without essentially chastising them. In the instance of like Donald Winnicott, which he quotes pretty extensively, there's a case in which a mother is trying to be very involved with her child's analysis, and the way that Winnicott essentially treats her is that she is an overbearing mother. She's a mother that is trying to smother her child. In this instance, the alternative that Ettinger is trying to formulate is trying to come up with a way of dealing with this sort of interweaving compassions between people. And the stakes of at the end of the day of the ethics of psychoanalysis here is basically that if we the problem becomes when we deny the matricial, essentially. If we deny the matricial, what we're left with in psychoanalysis is an empathy with a compassion, an empty empathy, essentially, where we really can't see past the projective semblances of the transference and countertransference. You know, there's nothing like the sense between the analyst and analysand, and you know, counter to the well-known tendency where when we are entering the clinic, we have to sacrifice something, often financial. The matricial is not something that can be clear-cut separated from. So the question when we're dealing with the ethics of psychoanalysis and the responsibility behind of psychoanalysis is extended to the point where we have to ask questions of care, respect, and compassion with regards to the matricial, something that extends beyond the transference and counter-transference in asking questions like, what impact do these interventions that we have in the clinic have on future helpless others, for example? what I'm doing in the clinic, how is that affecting, let's say, a person's child or a person's friend or someone who is not even immediately related to the person that we have immediately in the clinic. The same way that they themselves have been affected through these sorts of interventions in the past. Again, for Edinger, the matrix shell is pretty intergenerational. So the point of why I went through this diatribe of different models in which we can think about psychoanalysis is essentially that we're dealing with this question, like, can we articulate, and this is something that Gabriel Tupinamba tries to do with the Desire of Psychoanalysis, his text. Can we articulate some sort of genericity inherent to psychoanalytic thinking that is otherwise obscured by the logic of the signifier, Oedipus, the phallus, all these things that have become very well known as standard staples of psychoanalysis. And the point has become essentially that these structures are contingent, they're contingent operative limits for the procedures of what we're trying to do as Freudian, Lacanian, object relationships, and even other forms of psychoanalysis. So the problem really becomes when they're quasi-transcendentalized, when they're, when this contingency is retroactively mistaken for a necessity, when we think that the beginning and the end of psychoanalysis is going to be Oedipus. One could even note that even in the storytelling of Oedipus, Oedipus eventually arrives at Colonus. At some point, Oedipus gets past himself. So why should not psychoanalysis? And that kind of becomes the problem when we put psychoanalysis at Colonus, essentially. And the thing is, this is not to say that we have to drop the Oedipus complex or the logic of the signifier or the feminine non-all completely. I think the point here is so much that it has its value, has its operative limitations, sure, but it also has its operative efficacies, as long as we understand that they are within a certain limit. What the San Thom is able to achieve for us is that it relativizes these things to modalities of the San Thom. And so at this point, we're finding ourselves in a situation where we're trying to articulate a generic psychoanalysis and an impure psychoanalysis. The difference between a psychoanalysis terminable and a psychoanalysis interminable, between finite and infinite procedures in psychoanalysis. In a sense, psychoanalysis is a short circuit of theory and practice, and myth is precisely the way in which it articulates that. Here I quote Tupinamba essentially saying this: psychoanalytic thinking is generic because it's terminable and interminable, a set of finite processes that stitch together an infinite procedure. And when we look at myths like Tiresias, the Persephone-Demeter complex, the case of Ilse, where she comes up with the San Thom of calling herself the parent rather than the mother and the father, we know that there's going to be many cases of this to come. And when we look at all these different mythotopological structures, it seems that psychoanalysis is not what it used to be. And the point that I'm trying to make is that perhaps psychoanalysis never was that. Maybe we had too many assumptions about what psychoanalysis even was. So there are changing tides to psychoanalysis, and it has happened historically. Julie will probably know this pretty well, but we moved from Freud's early positive pastoralism to the death drive, where we're dealing with this fundamental core of psychoanalysis. We have the early splits between all these forms like, object relationships, Jungianism, Reichianism, there's so many isms that have come from Freud, and then we have Lacan's return to Freud. And nowadays we seem to be having our Jacques Milleranianisms or Alain Badiou-isms, Zizekisms, even Antiquarianism. So there seems to be this constant issue with psychoanalysis that is in a constant retrieval of itself. And so this is the interesting thing. Psychoanalysis forgets itself in productive ways that are sometimes unconscious to it. Lacan once said, psychoanalysis is not a San Thom, but psychoanalysts are a San Thom. So psychoanalysts, in a sense, are the mutual results of this forgetful activity of psychoanalysis, which again forgets precisely what it has, that it has nothing but an ignorance of the what I would call the sexual unconscious, and I mean that in a feminine sense. We seem to. The problem is that we treat this as a done knowledge, but what we're realizing is that we're actually developing a knowledge of this through this very plasticity of psychoanalysis, to these very short circuits of psychoanalysis. So it seems that the knowledge of psychoanalysis that we are starting to get is also a transformation of psychoanalysis. This minimal insight into psychoanalysis opens the field of psychoanalysis so that Oedipus, again, is a fragment of a broader myth. And in the field of the unconscious, the psychoanalysis models its formations through myths that captivate certain fixities and ostensive flexibilities. So what we're really finding in psychoanalysis is that it seems to be at a point where it can become self-aware of this happening in it. So in response to someone like Paul Preciado, who has called for a mutant psychoanalysis to respond to changes in how we think about sex, gender, and sexual difference, I would actually argue that psychoanalysis is itself this mutant psychoanalysis. And it can't help but purify itself in making operative limits. At the end of the day, in order to actually achieve anything, it can't be a generic psychoanalysis. It has to get its hands dirty. And so ultimately, this presentation is just part of an invitation to, we need to learn to get our hands dirty in more ways than we can imagine. That's the presentation. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you, Julie. I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I said I like your mutation of psychoanalysis more than original psychoanalysis that never actually existed. I'll stop recording and we can proceed to our secret discussion, all right?